Good morning, and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm David Berto. I'm the director of the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group here at CSIS. And we periodically like to get together with this audience to talk about European defense trends. And today we have quite a set of interesting information that's come to our attention and that we've built up here, and we look forward to sharing that with you. I want to urge you to silence your cell phones or I guess actually those in the room, I'd like you to silence your cell phones. Those of you who have joined us on the web, you can do whatever you want, but I would particularly like it if you would send me an email and let me know that you're watching. That would be to dberto@csis.org. I also want to recognize my colleague here this morning, Julie Smith, who is the most European-oriented person in the entire Department of Defense. And we consider that to be high praise. She works for the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European Policy, is it?
European and NATO policy.
European and NATO policy.
NATO.
Don't forget NATO. We never forget NATO here. And of course, prior to 2009, Julie was the chair of our European program here at CSIS, and so she has been a long-standing participant in our activities here. It's also important for me to recognize the value of our current folks here at CSIS who are core to our European efforts. Heather Connolly, who is the director of our Europe program, could not be here this morning, and Dr. Steve Flanagan, who is the Kissinger Chair. Together, we've been integral in our efforts across CSIS to focus on these important European issues, if you will. I think also I would remind those of you who are logging in from the web, you can find the presentation there for download. You won't be able to see the charts in the video this morning. You'll just see our smiling faces up here talking. But you will be able to download the charts and you can follow them at home. And as I reference them, I'll give you the chart number so you can follow along, if you will. What brings us here today is really an update from the report that we issued last November. There were copies of it outside. Many of you probably picked it up. This is our November 2010 report on European defense trends. And while we don't update that report every year, we generally update it every other year, when we got the 2010 data, there were enough changes from what we expected in the data that we thought it important and relevant to put out an updated briefing, which is what you have here today, and to bring attention to those changes and unexpected trends, if you will, in European defense spending. And so that's our purpose for being here with you today. Down the road, we will update the report. We try to be both calendar-driven and event-driven in those kinds of terms. So we look forward to doing that. But we want to review kind of what we said last year, the data we showed last year, what we said you should expect with those data, and what actually happened. Our report has three areas that we focus on. One is defense spending across Europe. The second is the regulatory environment, and particularly the changes in directives that were promulgated by the European Commission and are being gradually implemented. And third is our own focus on European defense industry, if you will. Our methodology is we start with NATO's data. We add in non-NATO countries. We manipulate the data to a considerable extent because there's not commonality either in data definitions or data fields from country to country or even within countries from year to year or maybe even program to program. So we try to adjust as best we can for those different categories and representations. We cover 37 countries, essentially every European country of more than a few acres, other than Iceland, which has zero expenditures, and Russia, which we have not been able to penetrate their expenditures in any analytical way. And I'm not sure if I could that I would add them into these anyway. I still reflect a little bit of a pre-1989 mentality, perhaps in that regard. I notice you're not European, NATO, and Russian policy
No. We once
as
were.
of yet.
Those days are over.
So with that, let me turn to our charts here. The first chart we're going to cover is budgetary trends. So now chart 3. This is what we showed last year. This was spending from 2001 through 2009. This is actually updated from last year's charts because it's in constant FY10 euros rather than FY9 euros. But basically you see a 7% decline between 2008 and 2009. This is what we said you should look for. We basically said the probability of increases is unlikely, and we said the objective of maintaining stable European defense spending will probably prove to be elusive. So what actually happened? What actually happened is spending went up in 2010. I think that says our ability to make money on our prognostication potential is pretty limited. This is why we're in the think tank business, not in the investment business. Basically, we had about a 0.5% increase in real inflation-adjusted terms. So in the year after a 7% decline, when everyone predicted further decline, spending actually went up. And it went up in a number of countries. This is not just a single package. It went up in the United Kingdom. It went up in Turkey. It went up in Poland. So those were kind of your big NATO jumps. It went up in Sweden. It went up in Switzerland by over €500 million. So there was almost across-the-board level of increases. There were, of course, a number of countries with significant declines. Chart 6, we also track spending per soldier. And here, soldier is a shorthand version for military personnel. So I'm not just Army-centric, if you will. And the second set of data last November showed a slight decline in 2009 after years of growth in spending per soldier. And of course, this isn't because spending has gone up. It's because the denominator of the number of military personnel in uniform in Europe went down faster than spending was going down. So the per soldier spending was still going up. On chart 7, this is what we said. It's possible that that growth would be sustainable only temporarily. And we said that the two data points, 08 and 09, we couldn't quite tell whether that was a year-to-year fluctuation or the beginning of a new trend. So in a sense, we equivocated a bit more here than we did in the defense spending in terms of leaving ourselves room to be both right and wrong. But the result was actually the same. As you can see from the green here on chart 8, spending per soldier actually went up in 2010 as well. The third element we look at in defense spending in Europe in chart 9 is by categories, and we divide this into 4 basic categories. Equipment, which is at the bottom in the blue, personnel, which is obviously just like it is here, the vast majority of the spending, over 50%, that's the red in the middle. Infrastructure, which is a very small green part, and at the top, some combination of operation and maintenance and other. In some countries, other, of course, is a very large category. In others, it's actually fairly well defined. So this is the third set of data that we showed you last November. These are by percentages, and you basically see that from 08 to 09, equipment spending at the bottom was up very slightly. Personnel was down a bit, infrastructure was down a bit, and the O&M/other was up a little bit. I'm not going to tell you what we said because first I'm going to show you the data by actual euros, and so you can see the totals are down. But you can see on the per euro basis, essentially the percentages that were reflected on the previous chart. This is what we said. We basically said that the relative spending priorities might continue to shift towards operations and towards equipment. But the macro trends could actually force reductions in all of these accounts. So what happened? On chart 12, you'll see that defense spending on equipment actually had the 5th straight year of increase. And operations was actually down, personnel was down, infrastructure was slightly up, almost not enough to make a difference. Similarly, in the euro basis, the equipment piece is actually even more astonishing. At an inflation-adjusted rate of 43.3 billion euros across the 27 countries, it was the highest number on equipment spending since 2001. And again, if you look country by country, in fact, there's a pretty high correlation between the 5 countries with the biggest growth in defense spending and the countries with the largest growth in equipment defense spending. So what do we conclude from all of this budgetary data on chart 14? We learned that there was no decline in defense spending in 2010. Instead, there was a very modest increase, a more substantial increase in equipment spending. The per soldier spending grew again after a slight decline in 2009. Governments on average tended to increase the share of spending that went towards equipment. This, of course, is in direct contrast to what we tend to do in the United States when spending is going down, where equipment takes a larger share of the reduction than proportional. And in absolute terms, European governments allocated an increase of more than 3 billion euros in additional funding to equipment spending alone. So now we have a dilemma. What did we say about 2011? Right? So to repeat our predictions from last year, because if you say it's going to come down often enough, sooner or later you will be right, all right? Or is 2010 something that's going to repeat itself? We kind of think 2010 is an anomaly, but the data are quite clear that in fact the increase was real. So I'm going to move now to the question of the regulatory trends. And I'll come back at the end a little bit with some recommendations on the budgetary side. So this is our second area, if you will. Chart 16 is basically what we showed you in last year's report, basically three regulatory documents or packages that we were following. The first is the European Union's Defense Procurement Directive, which is regulations for defense and security-related procurement in Europe. It's tied actually to the interpretive communication on Article 296, which has now been renumbered to Article 346, which is basically what provides for contract award exceptions based on national security requirements, of security of supply sort of thing, basically keep the jobs at home kind of a provision. And then the third is the intra-EU export, what we refer to as the Transfer Directive, which is basically a single license for export across Europe. Those are the three directives that we were tracking. This is what we said last year in our November report. We said that the implementation of the directives could, in fact, considerably alter the European defense market in ways that perhaps might not be clear to us in America at this point in time, and perhaps not even clear to Europe. But much of that depended on the willingness of the Commission to stand up to the standard national imperatives. We were fairly optimistic about that potential last year in a couple of ways. But now we're watching 9 months later. This is what we see. First of all, we haven't seen much at all. Member states have been very cautious in their implementation of the procurement directive. There's no public list of who has yet passed new legislation, but if there were, it would be a very, very short list. The Commission itself is still pushing for a stricter interpretation of Article 346 and a reduction in procurement decisions that are made, awarded to domestic companies for purposes of security of supply. But the member states seem to be pushing back as well on this point, and we're seeing signs about that. So what's next, if you will? We think, this is pretty ambivalent, we think the impact still remains to be seen. However, what we really think is it may not be seen at all, because it is entirely possible that a nation will decide that, in fact, its position is going to be my existing statutory and regulatory arrangements are in compliance with the new directives. And whether or not that's true will be subject to the courts to decide upon challenge by another affected party, if you will. And so this could take a long time to play out. And I think that was actually a development that we were insufficiently thinking about when we put our report together last year. So we're going to watch this very closely, but I think the evidence may be scarce, and that in itself will be evidence of what's going on from our perspective. Now let me look at the defense industry trends themselves. This is kind of our third section. The methodology for this, by the way, is we created our own CSIS, European Security, Defense, and Space Index. 22 publicly traded companies from across Europe. This excludes companies that are largely owned by governments, and so they're not part of that process, as well as a number of private firms. The annual revenue is from small, 40 million euros a year, to, that doesn't feel small to me, but it feels small in a defense industry point of view, to about 24 billion euros a year. Hardware and services companies established in some emerging capabilities. Unlike the U.S., where most of our big defense companies are almost purely defense, in Europe, a lot of these companies are, in fact, multiple products and multiple markets, if you will. So many do operate substantial non-defense businesses, but we pretty much put a cap. You got to be 60% or more defense in order to be part of this index, if you will. And we benchmark it to the Morgan Stanley MSCI Europe Index of sort of non-defense peers, so we can compare performance, financial performance of our index companies against their broader market peers. What did we find? Chart 22. First of all, it shows the total European defense spending at the top, and you see that little 0.5% increase in the green bar to the right. The middle bar is actually the revenue from the indexed companies, and that, as you see, has grown substantially, and it continued to grow between 09 and 10 by about 10 to 15 billion euros. And then finally, the bottom is the spending on defense equipment, which has that 3 billion euro increase, if you will. So revenue of our index companies increased both higher in absolute terms and in relative percentage terms than either European defense spending or spending on equipment. Why is that? Chart 23, it's because exports are growing to the rest of the world. And on this chart, what you see is essentially most of our companies, there are a couple of smaller companies, maybe about 5 billion euros, 5 or 6 billion euros in total revenue out of the 115 billion or so, that don't report their earnings or their revenue in such a way that I can break it down by geographic origin. But this is about 97% of the total revenue of our index companies. And you can see that between 08 and 10, the North American share of the market was basically flat. The European share, which is at the bottom, was down about 4%, and the rest of the world was up about 13%. This is in contrast to the period between 2003 and 2008, where the U.S. portion of revenue was growing much faster than the other elements, if you will. So we've seen a pretty dramatic shift. Last year it was a one-year shift. Now we've got 2 years in a row, so we feel pretty comfortable that we're starting to see a trend here in terms of where the growth is coming from these companies. Shown another way on chart 24, this shows you the year by year. The blue at the bottom is European revenue, the red in the middle is North American revenue, and the light color at the top, I call it green, but it probably has a multisyllabic name than that, is in fact the rest of the world where you see that growth. Let's look then very quickly at a number of financial measures, if you will. This is operating margin. This tracks back actually to 1990. This goes back a lot further than our other data because we like to watch market trends over a fairly long period of time. But for this morning, I'm going to focus mostly on the last year, the 09 to 10 changes, because that's the update from last year's report. Basically, compared to their publicly traded non-defense counterparts, operating margin is up, but it's up not as fast as their non-defense peers, which increased even more. On the next chart, chart 26, you see the return on invested capital, where here the defense index companies are performing substantially better in 2010 than their non-defense peers at a much substantially higher rate. Chart 27, which is R&D, and we take this not only as an absolute, because of course we can't actually separate R&D for defense purposes from R&D from non-defense purposes, but it is a pretty strong indication of the way these companies collectively view the potential market for the next few years. And what we see here is the defense companies had an increase in their R&D expenditures in 2010. Their non-defense peers actually had a reduction in the percentage of their total revenue that was devoted to R&D. That says to us that the defense companies see a more optimistic future in the near term, the next 3 to 4 to 5 years, than their non-defense peers. When we look, however, in chart 28 at capital expenditures, we see essentially the reverse story. The non-defense peers, which is the dotted line, is essentially flat in 2010. That doesn't say they're optimistic, but it also doesn't say they're pessimistic. The defense companies are actually down in terms of their capital investments in 2010. We're getting close to the end here. So here's what we see as the key developments in 2010 from the industry. This is chart 29. Their revenue and their margin and their return on invested capital continues to expand. That growth in revenue is not from the European or North American defense and security markets, but rather from the rest of the world. And average R&D increased while the capital expenditures declined. So this says a lot about their views of the future. I now have 4 areas where we have some conclusions and recommendations, and then I'm going to turn it over to Secretary Smith here. First, with respect to European governments, we still do think, as I said earlier, that overall European defense spending will decline and that 2010 is an anomaly. We think that the best way to cut spending is, in fact, to reduce unnecessary redundancies. This, of course, requires some collaboration, and I'll come to that in a bit. We need to avoid the second bullet, which is to create unwarranted capability gaps. If everybody cuts the same redundancy, it's no longer a redundancy. We need to continue to protect the investment accounts. We think that overall Europeans have done a good job in that regard, although we have no evidence that this is a collective conscious decision, but the net effect is the same. We think this actually dictates the need for exploring opportunities for collaboration, and that collaboration can be intra-European, it can be with the U.S., or it can be with other third countries, if you will. We see a pretty strong need to broaden the dialogue with industry. One of the things we've not really documented in our report, but that we find as we go through all of our discussions and our analysis here, is that European governments tend to have far less discussions with industry, far less dialogue with industry than we do here in the U.S. Now, that's not to say that what we do here in the U.S. actually meets a standard of reasonableness or success, but in Europe it's substantially less. And this makes it much more difficult, if you will, to create either the collaborative environment or the set of outcomes that would be most desirable from a national security point of view. And finally, we think that it's pretty important to advise that, in fact, that equipment spending be spent on operationally relevant spending rather than just protecting domestic jobs, which occasionally does become an objective. We have a couple of recommendations on the union side, which is in fact continue to push for the implementation of the directives and to continue to push for a stricter adherence to the Article 346 exceptions only when really necessary. And for industry, I think our conclusions are that, in fact, industry is globally competitive, probably more so than we thought when we first started looking at this a couple of years ago and created our index. We do see some strong indications that they're taking perhaps a stronger short-term view of the viability of the market than a long-term view. And we do expect that they will continue diversification towards non-U.S. and non-European markets. One possible change in that could be if the U.S. is actually successful in pursuing its efforts to reform export controls, which could in fact change the dynamics of that market considerably. That's something we watch separately. We don't report on it on this report, but there's certainly a lot of activity going on in that regard. I said I had 4 areas of recommendation. I only have 3 charts because my final set of recommendations is really for the United States. Last November, we urged strongly that, in fact, all of these dynamics that are occurring in Europe are not something that the U.S. has no interest in. Obviously, we have a very strong vested interest in both the dynamics themselves and the process and in the outcomes. And what we posited last year, and I think Jim Townsend was over here on our panel at that time, and he tended to agree with that, is that the U.S. really needs to identify opportunities to take action to support and encourage the kinds of outcomes and the kinds of behaviors that we think are beneficial to the transatlantic security relationship, and to engage actively in a wide range of areas, both overt and perhaps less visible in providing that encouragement. So we're really delighted this morning to have Julie Smith here with us. As I mentioned, she is a senior official in the Pentagon in European policy. I think you called yourself the European geek, the Pentagon's European geek. That has a very nice acronym to it. I may actually want to adopt that. And prior to that, of course, a long and distinguished track record with the European program here at CSIS. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to you, and welcome.
Great, thanks, David, and thanks for all the work that your team has put into this study. It's really some great data and very useful for those of us inside the belly of the beast when we don't find the time to undertake this kind of research, and so we rely on you and your team heavily. I think just to start off, I think David's exactly right when he talks about making predictions for what next year's presentation might look like as the data continues to extend out. I think our perspective, at least in the administration, is we would expect a fairly pessimistic view and the trend lines to spiral down a little bit, in part because there's some very significant reviews that are not yet included in this timeline. Notably, the UK SDSR would be one that comes to mind, but I could name several. The Netherlands recently announced their cuts and their reform efforts. Germany obviously is undergoing significant reform and carrying out with its own plan. So it will be fascinating to actually look at this, not just in the next year, but thinking about it kind of 5 to 10 years out, what not only the sheer numbers will look like, but but really if you started looking at capacity and capabilities, what we're going to end up with. And I think that negativity, that pessimism that exists inside the administration really gets at the heart of Secretary Gates' speech on June 10th in Brussels. And one of the reasons he wanted to kind of leave with this parting shot that some would say was a little bit harsh, I think what motivated him is his deep, deep concerns about where the NATO alliance is headed, where the European Union, where individual countries are headed in the transatlantic relationship, and that spurred a number of very frank and honest comments. He also wanted to talk a little bit about where the U.S. is in all of this, and I'll get to that in a minute. The other reason that we're feeling somewhat negative and frankly very worried about the future state of transatlantic defense is we're not exactly sure what's going to happen as the transition in Afghanistan is completed. Countries are, many of them, at least behind closed doors, are saying all the right things, including following the transition plan and sticking to the timeline and getting us to 2014. There'll be a couple of countries that will offer up some surprises along the way, no doubt. But nonetheless, we feel like we're hearing all the right things, but I think you could say with some certainty that a lot of countries are going to breathe a sigh of relief, say, thank God we've gotten some of our troops back. Now's the time to kind of double down, think about ways we can identify cost savings. Should there be some sort of peacetime dividend? You know, I think there's a real possibility that as countries come off the mission in Afghanistan, even if it's not in full, that they'll be looking at this as a way to a possibility or a window to catch their breath and identify additional cost savings and really not maintain what they have in hand and what they've acquired since they got involved in the Afghanistan mission. Another factor driving some of the pessimism among the Europe crowd and the administration right now is Libya and what we're seeing on the ground there. As you've no doubt heard, just 6 or 7 weeks into the operation, we had a scenario in which some of the even larger allies in the alliance were starting to run out of munitions, revealing some significant capability shortfalls. I think that surprised some of us. I mean, if you look at NATO's level of ambition, the kind of 2+6 framework, you really, it's hard to imagine where we're at right now. We're not at 2+6, but many allies are struggling to maintain their commitment to the current operations. And in fact, I would note that even NATO chose to cancel a CMX exercise. And you think, well, gee, if we can't do CMX exercise, we can't pull off Libya and Afghanistan, and yes, we have piracy in the Balkans, but still, it's not exactly getting to that level of ambition, and so it can lead to quite a bit of pessimism. We also had a country, the UK, that jumped into Libya and decided to use some of the assets it had already labeled or tagged for decommission, and so you wonder about if we have to pull off a Libya operation or that type of operation in the future, could we do it, in fact, 5 to 10 years from now, and what would be the impact? And of course, lastly on Libya, I would say, you know, the United States, while it's playing this supporting role and trying to stay in the shadows a little bit, the truth is that we are providing a great deal of the ISR support, tankers, and other critical capabilities that some of the larger allies lack. And so again, when you think about the future of the alliance and the types of capabilities that NATO will have on hand in the future, it does create quite a bit of concern. So when we think about all of this, the real question is what do we do about it? And David and his team offered up some very good recommendations that I agree with in 3 categories. Well, 4, you talked about the US, the EU, industry, and European countries as individual nations. And I think you hit many of the important points. One thing, though, that I think that's missing from your list is coordination. I think we are not seeing efforts by any of the governments in the EU or NATO to coordinate these reforms and reviews that are coming out of national capitals. We found out basically third hand about the UK decision to take almost 20,000 troops out of Germany. I mean, they did not brief NATO on that decision. And so we're waking up and either reading it about it in the newspaper or we're hearing from a friend trend in a particular capital, and that's not going to benefit the alliance long term. It's not going to benefit the EU. We could potentially end up with a whole host of countries making decisions in a vacuum, which they have every right to do, but without coordination, when you're looking at smart defense initiatives, I mean, you don't want to end up with 28 countries all choosing the low-hanging fruit and nobody investing in the hard stuff. And so there's quite a bit of concern about how we get better coordination to take place. Should this be led by ACT? Is this a role for the EDA? Are there other forums we could utilize, other leaders that are willing to take a leadership role in trying to conduct this symphony and bring together all the different components that we're seeing? And that has not been resolved, and that's going to have to be the focus in the months and years ahead. And it's quite urgent because additional reforms are coming down the pipe. You didn't have NATO on your list, so I would add that. In part because we have a NATO summit coming up that the U.S. will host in May of next year in Chicago, and there's going to be a lot of interest in how this summit will answer what Secretary Gates outlined in his speech on June 10th. We can't simply go from the June 10th speech to champagne toasts in Chicago without any real initiatives that answer the capability shortfalls and some of the gaps that were highlighted in that presentation. And so lots of ideas are circulating around. Of course, the Secretary General himself, he's promoting his smart defense plan that was outlined primarily in his Munich speech at the Munich Security Conference earlier this year, but this is a theme that comes up regularly in all of his presentations. Here, he's urging countries to take on what actually we worked on here, Michelle Flournoy and I and a whole host, that Guy was part of it. The European Defense Integration Report talked about pooling, specialization, multinational procurement, the importance of these types of initiatives, getting a bigger bang for your buck. That's going to have to be the way forward. In many ways, it's the only way forward, particularly for some of the smaller allies. The other question on the table is whether or not NATO should kind of come up with a grandson of DCI. We had son of DCI, the PCC. I guess we did have the grandson of DCI, I mean, the Lisbon Capabilities Initiative, Commitment Initiative. So maybe we need the great-grandson of DCI. Personally, I'm skeptical. I can't say that at every turn these initiatives have produced real results. We have moved the ball down the field a little bit, but I'm not sure that we need another DCI. The other question that's on the table is whether or not the large allies in the alliance should come together and think about how do we preserve the core. You could look at, say, the Germany, France, the UK, the United States. I mean, there are others that could potentially be folded into that list. But as the larger allies think about cuts they may need to make, and the U.S. needs to include itself in that list, how do you kind of put a ring fence around the core capabilities and preserve what's absolutely critical for NATO to meet its level of ambition? And how you would do that is being batted around on both sides of the Atlantic right now. There are lots of ideas circulating. But I think we're now asking the question, do these larger countries have a slightly different set of responsibilities, and do they need to set the gold standard and serve as an example to some of the smaller countries, and also serving in leadership roles to launch additional capability initiatives? And this is something that we're kind of churning on right now in various interagency discussions. For the United States, the question here is, how can the United States continue to show real leadership while at the same time admitting, as Secretary Gates did, that we have our own challenges. As he outlined in the speech, the United States is also feeling the pinch from the financial crisis. We know that cuts are coming in the Pentagon. There are potentially some severe cuts that could have a major impact on transatlantic defense, and we have to be very realistic and honest with our European allies. I think we also have to be honest with them about what's changed in the United States. For example, when I have to go up to Congress and explain the role and value of the NATO alliance and why the United States continues to carry much of the burden, I'm met with, a lot of glazed over looks, why are we doing this? Why are we supporting this alliance? When are the Europeans going to step up? Why can't they pull off Libya Libya without us? How do you explain these gaps? And so increasingly, the generation in Congress that had exposure to transatlantic defense, supported the transatlantic relationship, maybe spent time in Europe, maybe spoke a European language, that, as Secretary Gates said in the Q&A part of his speech, it's aging out. That generation is aging out. And what's coming in is a new generation of folks in Congress that have less interest, less exposure, less commitment to the transatlantic relationship. And that will impact our role in this relationship. I'm not saying that suddenly the U.S. is going to pack it in and say we're not going to be part of this club anymore, but when it comes to U.S. leadership and investment and resourcing, the dynamic is changing, and it's becoming much harder to make this case up in Congress, and frankly, with the American public. So we know that the U.S. Has to play a strong leadership role in grappling with many of the challenges that are presented here today with this data. But at the same time, I think we have to recognize that we're up against our own obstacles as well. And that's why we have to work creatively to come up with these multilateral, multinational solutions. We have to put the burden back on European countries. We have to fire off the warning shots, as Secretary Gates did, and have a really honest-to-God conversation about what's in the realm of the possible in light of the fact that the cupboards are bare. So not to be too gloomy, but I think we really have our work cut out for us. And frankly, I think we're going to have challenges in making sure that the Chicago summit next May explains to the American public the value of this alliance, how important it is, echoes its achievements, and applauds and salutes its achievements, and there are many, but at the same time offers up some concrete initiatives and proposals that shows that we're finding creative ways to deal with what was presented here today. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, David.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent tour, and of course, I took notes of what to update in our own recommendations as well. I think those are excellent suggestions. What we'd like to do now is to open the floor for questions and from the audience, both here in the room and on the web. Before I do that, though, I want to point out a couple of other activities, if you will, that I think are indicative, perhaps, of both opportunities and challenges. CSIS last year participated in what was a historically unprecedented study. It was a European Commission-funded study with 4 think tanks, one of which was a U.S. think tank. And it was our privilege to be selected as that think tank. It's unprecedented because there has never before been an award to think tanks by the EC that included a U.S. think tank as one of the awardees. This looked actually at a fairly narrow set of questions. It was a question of what happens with the defense industry in Europe, not from defense spending point of view, but with what they call security, what we call homeland security. And that led to a number of collaborative efforts, not the least of which was the beginnings of a recognition of the importance of having good data. Because many of the suggestions you make for both NATO and for the European countries, and the recommendations that we make, do depend on information being there. It's pretty hard to tell what the consequences of your decisions are if you don't even know what the starting point is or how you're going to measure that. And I was encouraged, and I think all of the folks involved in it from our end were encouraged by the beginnings of a recognition. It was as simple as when we showed our charts, they sort of said, how come we don't know that stuff about our own governments? And that's the kind of question I'd like to see raised over and over again, because I really think that the beginning of good policy is good information. The second is, and I want to recognize Steve Flanagan, who's joined us here, is some work we did for the National Intelligence Council here, and that report is also available on our website that looks at a host of these questions from the integrated U.S., not just the Defense Department point of view, but from the broader U.S. foreign policy point of view, and I think that's another plus, if you will. With that, I'll throw the floor open for questions. We have microphones. What I'll ask you to do is raise your hand. Wait for the mic. When you get the mic, speak into it. Identify yourself, your affiliation, and state your question. If you're on the web, you can send me an email with your question to dberteau@csis.org. And if we like the question or understand it, we'll be able to answer it. Let me start here in the middle.
Hi, Ken Oscar, Floor Corporation. When you mentioned the revenue growth of defense companies in Europe, you said that some of that was attributable to exports. And I wonder if you have a finer breakdown. In other words, selling an airplane to Brazil is an export. But what do you consider, say, a European company buying a U.S. company making a U.S. product in the United States? Do you have some kind of a little bit finer of what's really happening there in industry?
I think in some cases we do, but we don't have it in enough companies' cases to be able to aggregate the data across the board. Let me check with my guys here. Is that pretty much? I mean, there are some companies who do report data down to that level of detail. There are others who we can't tell. The other thing that we really can't tell, Ken, and I think this is significant, is what portion of that revenue is actually booked as revenue to them and what part is actually subcontractor revenue. Again, we can't break that out. Of course, we can't even do that for U.S. companies, much less for there's also, of course, a difference between revenue that's generated by independent sales and revenue that's actually government-sponsored sales, and we really can't separate those two out either at this stage of the game. Those are both all important refinements that would be useful to have going forward. Any other questions or comments, reactions? So. Hang on, Jeff. There you go.
Jeff Bialos. I look at these charts, and to me, the year or two, it's good to see the data, but doesn't really change the story. If you go back to your first chart, the decade, I mean, that's the story. You know, I mean, while I don't disagree with anything Secretary Gates said, I think Lord Robertson said Europe's headed to being a military pygmy 5-10 years ago. Yeah. We've had 10 years, not that chart, the chart that, the very beginning, there's a chart that really shows the picture. 2000, that one, that one. I mean, so what did we do? We moved the needle, you know, 2 bits? Right. I mean, so we have a decade-long problem. And the dilemma is, while I applaud what I agree with what Secretary Gates says, we fell again into the classic trap. The American approach is to say, woe is me, the Europeans ought to spend more, they ought to spend better, and it's terrible, all right? And let's give another list to them, and let's see if they do it and they don't. And I think, frankly, we're guilty in some part. We've tried these initiatives, and, you know, the Washington Summit, the Prague capabilities, Lisbon, and you know, I mean, I think in the beginning it was a good, valiant idea, but it's failed. Let's be honest about it. And when you look at this, you see a Europe that, you know, I think is on a trajectory to be able to field a moderately effective police force in the next decade on its current trajectory, frankly. And I think we have to change our approach to the United States and, you know, get away from, you have the high priests of NATO, who, you know, I think we're wedded to a certain set of orthodoxies that make it hard for us to change, frankly. And you've got some of those high priests over there that you sit with, Julie, every day. And, you know, I think we need to begin to differentiate roles. I'm glad you guys mentioned the EU and EDA, but I think we need to think differently. I guess the way I look at it is that needle isn't going to go up materially in the next 10 years. It's just not. They're not going to spend materially more money. I don't care what the next Secretary of Defense says. There are 2 or 3 countries willing to engage with us in high-intensity warfare. The rest aren't that interested, or at most can bring specialized capabilities to the fore. Most of the rest of Europe is developicized and basically says, I mean, the Norwegians don't even have police with guns. You know, fundamentally, the rest of Europe is interested in low-intensity conflicts at best. And my own view is we need to do something very different. We need to basically, essentially say, okay, let's recognize realities and not roll stones uphill and differentiate. Work with the couple on the high-intensity side. If Europe wants to do low-intensity through the EU, we ought to let them go that route and empower them. And if, you know, we have Southern Med responsibility, give it to Italy to lead. So you go ahead and figure it out. I mean, I think we need to do that. And further, you know, it's nice to talk about pooling, but, you know, the United States says, you guys ought to pool. Go ahead, pool. And you know what that's going to get you?
Jeff, I hate to interrupt you. I
sorry,
assume you're leading to a question which says, do we have any comment on your
well, you asked
lecture?
the questions or comments, so
Right,
I
right.
wanted to react. Let me finish by saying, I guess, Julie, the question is the administration willing to walk away from the orthodoxy that indeed itself is shown over the last couple of years and do things like incentivize the Europeans to pool by participating in these kind of efforts?
Can I make a data comment, and then you can make a policy comment? Actually, two data comments that derive from yours there. One, of course, is the chart that you're seeing here. This is chart 5 for those of you who are on the web. Dramatizes the decline, obviously, from the scale. All right, and now it is a decline, and it's not a trivial decline, but it is a decline of essentially about 12% over the course of a decade. I would submit to you that both the U.S. and Europe face a substantially greater potential decline over the next decade. And so I think you can draw conclusions from this, but I think it's likely to be more significant than that. For those of you who saw our presentation where we did the lessons from the last budget drawdown in the U.S., you know that one of our primary conclusions, if you put on this chart U.S. spending countervailed with it, all right, and you broke the U.S. spending down into those things that were dedicated to the supplementals and the war, and that spending which was part of the base budget, you would see, in fact, that while the U.S. had a significant increase, that increase did not go towards investment in hardware and capability. It went to operations. And so as a starting point for the drawdown, I would submit that the difference between the U.S. and Europe is perhaps less than appears by transposing these data. I think that makes the policy choices not only U.S. policy choices towards Europe, but U.S. policy choices towards itself. And that's obviously a broader conversation here. So with that, let me turn it over to you.
Well, you raised many good points, but I think when everyone set out to work on this speech and support what the Secretary wanted to message with it, we knew that there have been countless speeches where there's been a U.S. official up on a podium wagging the finger saying, meet your 2% targets. There are only 3, 4, 5 countries that meet that. Shame on you. We've seen that movie over and over and over. And you're right, it hasn't yielded big, grand results. But what we wanted to do with this speech is highlight a couple different facts. You'll note in the speech, we actually made sure that the Secretary, and he wanted to pursue this route, highlighted 2 or 3 countries. He called out specific countries that do not meet the 2% target to show that it's not a matter of spending more. And I think he said in the speech, look, I know we're not going to get Europe to spend more. So he held back from making that recommendation or that push. What he said is there are countries like Norway and Denmark who have spent less than 2% of GDP on defense for ages, for as long as we can remember, and yet what happens? They always show up at game time. They are always there for us. See Libya, see Afghanistan. They take on the heavy burden. They don't hide in the shadows. They don't take the light lift back in the woods somewhere. They are front and center with the United States, with others. Libya is remarkable in terms of what the Norwegians have done. The percentage of responsibility that they've taken on, if you look at the percentage of ordinances dropped, per country, it boggles the mind, the lift that Norway has taken on. And so what Secretary Gates wanted to say is, look, we know you're not going to hit the 2% target, but my God, even if you're at 1, 1.5, 1.7, whatever it is, ensure that you get your spending evened out. Don't have it be the pension program that it is in some countries, but ensure that you use that money and the old bumper sticker, spend more wisely. And so he wanted to tip his hat and say there are countries that have done that. And if we saw that happening more often on the European continent, we'd be in a much better place. Now, he also used the speech to talk about his own personal surprise in the fact that in 2010, when the U.S. decided to surge, we got another 10,000 troops out of Europe, which was shocking. I mean, we were taking bets in the office and thinking, no, we'll shake out another, 500 troops with our tin cup. up, walking around in national capitals. And at the end of the day, NATO allies really delivered at a time when public support for the mission has been spiraling down since 2001. And so that was a remarkable achievement. And he wanted to highlight the fact that he doesn't belittle or discredit the 40,000 plus troops that are in Afghanistan from Europe and how important that was. So this wasn't intended just to be doom and gloom. There were elements of doom and gloom. But what he wanted to say is that there are little silver linings, and that if we could pursue some of the paths that countries have taken individually, and if NATO gets on board and really pursues, or the EU, this smart defense concept in a more effective, efficient way, perhaps there's hope. Now, he also said that smart defense or pooling and sharing isn't a panacea, and he wanted to be clear about that. He has very strong views that that's not the be-all, end-all answer to the crisis we find ourselves in. It's going to take more than that. So he closed the speech by saying, this is the path we're kind of on, and potentially the U.S. could find itself hitting the wall. You know, when we had to go up and tell Congress the U.S. was supporting 50% of the alliance, then folks would say, all right, it seems, you know, a bit unfair and skewed, but we can deal with it. When it's 75, you start to hit that threshold. I mean, the question Secretary Gates wanted to pose, what happens when it's 80, 85? You know, when is enough enough? And so he was saying to Europeans, we're at another fork in the road, but this is dire because of the financial crisis. The trend lines keep slipping. We can take one of two paths. He was warning that this second path, the more negative outcome, is very real. And I think he wanted to be blunt and frank and honest about that, but he wasn't definitive in saying that has to be the outcome. Now, if in fact we do take the dire consequences route and we don't get our act together and pull our socks up, and NATO and the EU and individual countries take all the right steps, I think the question on the table is, are we going to see more coalitions of the willing, which is in fact how we got into Libya. And it was very odd for me to be thinking back to, you know, I was getting beat up all the time by European allies back in 2003 for Coalition of the Willing, but then with Libya, we had the French and the Brits openly talking about, hey, maybe this should just be a coalition of the willing. I was rubbing my eyes. So, I mean, I think we're going to find scenarios in which coalitions of the willing might be put forward more often than not just by the United States, but, oh, by the way, by some European countries. So who knows what the future holds, but I think what the Secretary wanted to point out is it will be increasingly difficult to paint that rosy picture and tip our hat to NATO achievements and all the rest if we don't make these other changes. But you're right. At the end of the day, we may be looking at a chart that's even worse than that in the years to come.
I have a question from the web, and then I have one more in the audience, and then I think we'll call it a morning. The set of questions from a web viewer really has to do with the newer and the older members of NATO, and whether we're seeing differences in terms of data trends and in terms of capability, et cetera. I would refer you back to our big report from last November, because there's a lot of data broken down country by country and region by region as well. We didn't update all of that for this purpose, but I think in general, and this kind of echoes a little bit on what you were saying, some of the countries where you really do get more bang for the buck than others. In general, we're seeing the newer members of NATO do have a stronger focus on maintaining expenditures on areas where they feel they need to. I think there's a higher correlation, at least one can posture a higher correlation between what they perceive as the risks or the threats that they associate with them and the kind of capabilities that they're investing in. And I think that potentially that holds some promise for a European focus that occasionally reminds itself that there's a reason that we have a military. And that's not an unuseful thing.
Can I just add one thing? There is some good news there, you're right, and if you look at the sheer numbers, I mean, it's amazing. A country like Estonia is really pushing its way up towards the 2% and wants credit for that and deserves credit for that. But at the same time, the bad news is if you look at Libya, I mean, the list of countries that are able to do that or undertake that type of operation fall on the western side of the continent. We only have 7 of the 28 allies contributing to the mission in Libya, and it really, I mean, it's black and white. It cuts right down. I mean, there's some political, obviously Poland had some issues with the mission itself, but even countries that wanted to participate couldn't find a way to do so because they just lacked the capabilities.
Right. I do know that if I lived in the Baltics, I would vote for higher taxes for my defense. but based on history. I think we'll take two, I tell you what, we're going to bundle three last questions, if you will. One here in the front, and then one in the middle, and then one on the right. So you guys all ask your questions, and then we'll answer them all and wrap it up.
Thank you, Dave.
Want my coat?
No, that's okay.
Peter Flory, NDU, Center for Transatlantic Security Studies, maybe more relevant previously, at least a medium priest or high altar boy at NATO. And Julie, this is a question for you. And coming out of your discussions with your European counterparts post-Libya, I mean, Libya was a big discontinuity, a big exogenous event in all of this. And I'm curious as to what you're concluding about the impact on European thinking of the Libya events, first of all, sort of politically, in the sense of, Afghanistan and the Balkans have been sort of the bookends for NATO's out-of-area experience. Well, here you have something that's it's less European than the Balkans, but it's a lot closer to home than Afghanistan, and for many Europeans, more closely linked to European security and what you might call social interests on things like human rights, Arab Spring, immigration, and things like that. So first of all, the sort of political impact. Secondly, in terms of what we're talking about primarily today, investments in defense and defense capabilities. As you said, the Brits, as they did back in the Falklands, by the way, have dusted off things that they were planning to get rid of and found them actually quite useful. And I know they've done sort of a review of their review. But how you see them handling that. And last of all, in terms of the European defense, when Libya came up, people went to the sort of European defense cupboard, and it was bare. There was only one thing to grab onto, and that was NATO, and happily people, including partisans of European defense, were pretty sensible about that. They didn't waste too much time, and they grabbed onto that. But in terms of how you think European nations are going to pursue the sort of the separate European defense path, or decide that maybe that's not a good use of their scarce resources. It's called a MIRV.
One next there.
Frank Savasco International, and again with a long history of NATO engagement from inside and outside. I've watched Europe and the U.S. in a lot of different ways over almost 3 decades, and if I look back at one subset of statistics, and David, you and your colleagues here have dug into this quite a bit, so I thought it was appropriate to push to you because I'm interested in what you find. The U.S. has outinvested in R&D, on all R&D, outinvested the Europeans by a modest amount, and that maybe 50%. Not a big thing given the diversity in Europe, but that's been relatively constant over almost 3 decades. But what has not been constant is the subset of that, defense R&D, where in the mid-'80s, the U.S. outinvested them by about, if I'm remembering correctly, a factor of 3. And last time I looked at a European Defense Industry Association report, that factor had gone from 3 to 1 to about 7 to 1. So at some point, does that have, in your view, an implication for the ability of our transatlantic industry to actually do things together? Or are we losing traction with one another? Are we going off in such an extreme, and they're not, that at some point we can't communicate with one another?
Good set of questions. And then finally, over here, and actually I'll give Steve Flanagan the last shot as well.
Marisa Lino from Northrop Grumman. I just wanted to take off on something you said with regard to this chart where you said that if you put up U.S. defense spending over the last decade and would break it out with respect to operations, I think it would be really interesting to have a chart that would have both of those. European defense spending with their operations broken out, U.S. defense spending with operations broken out. And I guess my question is, how would you factor in things that have been investments made that are directly related to operations? The growth of UAVs, now we're looking at blimps. I mean, those things, I don't know that they would be so neatly categorized as investments versus operations. Anyway.
Steve, you get the last question.
Okay, thanks. I have first a comment on capabilities and then a question about markets. But Julie, it seems to me your skepticism about a capabilities initiative is dead on. If you think about the notion of, I mean, first of all, at Lisbon, the Allies wouldn't agree to calling the package a commitment. I think it's indicative, and the notion of trying to mount a big capabilities initiative next spring in the middle of the next ESFS fundraising effort to bail out another Greek crisis or an Italian or a Spanish one, I think is beyond reality. So in that context, it seems to me a collaboration initiative or and I wanted to get your sense of what thinking in the Pentagon is about some of the initiatives that are underway. Admiral Pottinger at ACT has been looking at this issue, prospects for multilateral collaboration. There are a number of initiatives in Europe about collaboration, regional and functional cooperation. Could there be a cooperative imperative that is really seized upon, and where do you see, what is official thinking on that now, and what are you getting from your consultations with your allies? David, for you and maybe for some other people in the room, looking at markets for the future, European industry isn't going to survive on the European or the American market. Is the Gulf market going to be the focus, or are we going to see the China question raised again? We saw recently that there was the European Council evidently came very close to once again lifting Tiananmen sanctions. Is that on the horizon?
No, that's okay. So on Libya, Peter, that you raised a really good point. I mean, it's creating all sorts of reactions across the European continent. So it's hard to summarize and say, well, Europe as a whole feels X, not Y. But the comments and emotions that we're getting back from Libya already range from well, they all seem to say this whole role that you guys have carved out for yourself is curious and leaves us feeling, you know, to say the very least, uneasy, if not deeply frustrated and concerned. Different allies have come forward to express that with different degrees of severity. But, I mean, there have been allies who've walked in saying, this isn't going to work. You guys are eventually going to have to reverse your position to, this is uncomfortable. We'll try it on for size, but we hope you don't choose this path in the future and feel like you have to default to this supporting role for your own politics or whatever it may be. The other reaction we get that does pop up kind of across the continent writ large is kind of the wringing of the hands over the EU's role or not having a role, the lack of a vision and strategy coming out of Lady Ashton's office, big public statements about the Arab Spring more broadly, and then to narrow in on Libya, you're right. We looked in the cupboard was bare. There wasn't a lot of preference to have this be an EU mission. We decided to go with NATO. That was wise because of its longstanding history, its excellent command and control. You know, even the French will tell you honestly that while they fought it a little bit in the beginning, they found that relying on NATO was a wise choice and it's working and it was the right thing to do. So there is some wringing of the hands there and some a bit panicky in their assessment of, oh dear, what does this say about the future of EDA and CFSP and all the rest, or ESDP. And then you have some allies that are standing back, smiling, feeling quite proud. Norway has distributed statistics on how it's contributed to this mission quite widely. It does talk openly about the role that it's played. It's standing up straight, saying, gee, we were there. Now we've made some changes to our position in the Libya mission, but we were there in the first 2 months or 3 months, and we played a leadership role, and we feel good about that. And Europe, a European country, and others showed that we could take the lead, and so that you see that in other capitals as well. But then you do have the behind the scenes also in London and elsewhere, kind of biting the nails. Gee, when we set off on this path of reform and cuts, did we make the right decisions? I don't see major ramifications coming out yet. I don't think the the UK, for example, is going to revisit its decision to decommission Nimrods, but still there is a recognition that we were thinking about Afghanistan, when we were thinking about the future, nobody quite envisioned a Libya, and now, gee, maybe we, you know, as we always do, we're always fighting the last war, not quite thinking about other potential scenarios. And then there is this sentiment of, gee, this was kind of tailor-made for Europe, in the backyard, national interests for many of us, maybe not all of us, but in the neighborhood, that this seemed like not much of a heavy lift. We could kind of, well, of course, we all thought it would be quicker and faster, but yeah, there's some frustration there that, gee, Europe can't really pull this off. We've had munition shortages and all the rest. And so a lot of scratching of the heads. Now, how this plays long-term will depend on the outcome. If Gaddafi heads for the hills in the next few weeks and it's, you know, tagged as a big success, people will revisit kind of the tough moments we've had in terms of coalition sustainment or getting the right munitions to the right country, and so all of that could kind of be revised in the future. On Steve's question about these cooperative initiatives, I think we're excited about the fact that there's a lot of churn, a lot of folks, ACT has taken a strong leadership role. There's a wide recognition that smart defense has to be one wave of the future, but we're not seeing everybody, you know, put the keys in the engine and starting it up. I think a lot of countries seem to be waiting for the conductor to show up and direct of, okay, more violins, fewer drums here. You know, there's a sense that more is to come, and we will wait for leadership either from NATO, ACT, EDA, wherever, maybe the United States, but I don't get the sense that folks feel like there's a real plan, and we certainly don't feel like this happens to happen always in a very organic way. Now, in some cases, pooling and sharing and these multinational procurement initiatives have taken root, and some of them have been very successful. But what we haven't really seen countries do or institutions do is also kind of a best practice list. I haven't seen Thomas Valicek's work in London was very good. I know he went and did extensive interviews with countries around Europe on this. But other than that, I don't get the sense that countries are saying, now let's stand back. What's working and what's not with the Dutch-German Corps? How has the Spanish-Italian amphibious force panned out ever since they tried to start that initiative? Or let's look at Baltic cooperation or Nordic-Baltic cooperation and find those best practices and see if they can be replicated elsewhere. That still isn't, and I know ACT has a lot in mind in terms of its future role. So we're hopeful. We feel like the conversation has started. People are finally taking this concept seriously after talking about it for the better part of 20 years. But how that leads to real initiatives, I mean, remains to be seen. And I think Chicago will be that turning point, hopefully one milestone for the alliance in this regard. But again, as you pointed out, with the financial crisis, potential future bailouts, I mean, it's going to be difficult.
Let me make just a couple of comments. Frank, your question about R&D, I think, is a very legitimate question. There are some significant data problems in terms of what does Europe really spend R&D on, and I don't think we have yet found our way through those. But I do think there are a couple of other dynamics that come into play that we need to think about, and it's probably worth us taking a look at comparative European and U.S. R&D. One is that an awful lot of the U.S. expenditures on R&D over the last decade have actually been R&D procurement disguised as R&D. You know, the single largest R&D contract is for the F-35, and we're actually getting airplanes for that R&D. So it's not quite the same as basic research, if you will. There are also, I think, some difficulties in comparing how the U.S. from an operational point of view and Europe have spent their money. There's actually two levels of difficulty there. One is we actually can't tell within the U.S. because the level of precision of what constitutes supplemental funding and what it was spent on and how much of that actually goes into real operations. The filters of probity have yet to be applied to those funding streams, if you will, and I'm not sure we'll ever know the truth of that. Nonetheless, it is worth looking at relative comparisons with what data we do have, and I think that's worth taking a look at. And finally, Steve, your question about whether industry can survive, while I may be comfortable predicting that that green line is not going to continue going up next year, I'm not at all ready to say that defense industry is in fact anywhere near demise. And I think one of the fundamental questions and one of the things that we're actually seeing is industry is responding more rapidly to to the changing global threat environment than the countries themselves are. And I think that if you really want to see a leading indicator of where threats and capabilities merge together, you look at where industry is putting its own efforts and where they're building their own both business development and technical strategies, and you'll see a lot better sense of where the world is going than you will if you look at actually defense budgets that are being promulgated as well. So, you know, that's kind of the core of what our business is here. I would like to wrap up actually by recognizing some of the people in the room who are the stalwarts behind this. I think when you see the kind of work that gets put out by the staff that work on this, you're really impressed at the breadth and reach of that sort of thing. In fact, I got an email here that says, you know, where's your staff of thousands sitting here that looks at all this work? So I would like to ask Guy Ben-Ari, Joachim Hofbauer, and Roy Levy to stand, please, and have you join me in a round of applause thanking these folks for their tremendous work. My job is really easy. I just get to sit up here and explain the information. Their job is actually to create it, and that's by far the much tougher package. I want to thank you all for joining us this morning. I want to thank our attendees in our web presence. This will be available on the web for those of you who'd like to come back and revise and extend your remarks or mine. And we're looking forward to continuing to update this. We're looking forward to putting out a report. We're looking forward to the Europeans recognizing that, in fact, munitions count as much as platforms do. And you know, by the way, the only time you actually ever run out of targets is when you run out of ammunition. And so that's not always the right measure of success, if you will. So do you have any final words?
No, thank you.
All right. Thank you all very, very much.